There is a record I need you to know exists before I tell you what's in it. It sits inside the United States National Records Administration. It is not sealed. It is not classified. It was reclassified as non-sensitive in 1977, and since then it has remained in an archival box, quietly cataloged under a reference number that gives away absolutely nothing about what it contains. It is a handwritten logbook, 44 pages, oilskin bound, water damage on the lower left corner of every page. It belonged to a surveying officer aboard the USS Peacock, one of the 6 ships in the United States exploring expedition of 1838 to 1842. His name was William H. Garrett. His rank was acting master. His specialty was coastal and hydrographic documentation. He was 26 years old when the expedition left Norfolk, Virginia. He was 30 when it returned. He never sailed again. The logbook covers 14 weeks in early 1839, during the period when the Peacock was working the Antarctic coastline. For the first 29 pages, it reads exactly the way a naval surveyor's log is supposed to read. Navigational entries, depth soundings, weather notes, precise, controlled, impersonal. Then page 30 arrives, and something changes. The handwriting does not become wild or panicked. It becomes slower, thus larger, more deliberate. It looks like the hand of someone choosing every word carefully, as if he understands that what he is writing now requires a kind of precision different from numbers and bearings. And the subject changes completely. The entries stop being about measuring the coastline and start being about what was behind it. That shift is what I want to talk about today. Because I was not looking for this document, I was following a discrepancy between the Wilkes expedition's published charts and the raw hydrographic data filed with the Naval Observatory in the 1840s. In the course of that search, I came across a footnote in a 1962 naval history paper that almost no one seems to have read. It was 4 lines long. 4 lines. It said Garrett's logbook contained material Charles Wilkes had determined was outside the scope of official documentation. It said Wilkes had requested the log for review. And it said the log was returned to Garrett with 17 pages removed. Those 17 pages were not destroyed. They were filed separately, under a different reference number, in the same archive. They were reclassified at the same time as the logbook in 1977. There was no index entry linking them back to the original. I made that connection myself. Now, the United States exploring expedition of 1838 to 1842 is not some forgotten secret operation. This is well-known history. 6 ships, roughly 400 men, 4 years across the Pacific, the Antarctic coast, and the western shores of North America. Its commander, Charles Wilkes, returned with specimens that would become a foundational part of the Smithsonian Institution. His charts guided American naval vessels for decades. And the Antarctic portion of that expedition has always been handled a little carefully by mainstream history. Wilkes claimed he had identified continental landmass beneath the ice along what is now called Wilkes Land. He was challenged almost immediately by James Clark Ross, who argued that Wilkes had mistaken ice formations for coastline. That argument lasted for decades, and by the 20th century, aerial surveys had largely resolved it in Wilkes's favor. That is the official story. Discovery, dispute, vindication. But that official story leaves something out. It does not explain why, between Wilkes's return in 1842 and the publication of his official account in 1844, he personally reviewed and redacted the private records of at least 3 crew members, including Garrett. Requesting logs for review was within his authority. Removing pages and filing them under a separate classification was not standard procedure. That was something else. And before we even get to Garrett's words, there is another problem. The charts. The published 1844 charts of the Antarctic survey show a smoothed, continuous coastline. Broadly speaking, they are accurate. Modern satellite imagery confirms land beneath the ice in those general positions. But if you compare the raw hydrographic data filed with the Naval Observatory before the official charts were produced to the charts that were eventually published, you find something strange. Features that are present in the raw data do not appear in the published version, not corrected, not revised with notation, not explained, just removed. Now, cartographic smoothing is real. Navigation charts simplify details all the time. That by itself is not suspicious. But what disappeared from Wilkes's charts was not navigational clutter. It was geological description, specific description, measured description, located description. Observations of what the exposed coastline looked like in the marginal zones where the ice had been scoured back and the rock itself was visible. And that removal connects directly to what Garrett began writing on page 30. The Peacock was operating east of Wilkes's flagship, the Vincennes, in a sector the expedition's own operational records describe as a zone of unusual coastal exposure. Wind and current patterns in that area had stripped ice away from the coastal margins more than in surrounding regions, leaving the underlying rock open to direct observation. Garrett was the officer assigned to record what that exposed rock looked like. For 29 pages, he does exactly that in standard professional form. Then, in the middle of a routine navigational entry, 3 lines into the kind of record no one would ever think twice about. He stops and writes, "I have put down the measurements. I am going to write now what the measurements do not capture." That is the line. That is where the logbook changes. He describes approaching a section of exposed coastline in the ship's boat with 3 crew members. The ice had receded along a stretch he estimated at roughly 400 yards, exposing rock from the waterline up to about 60 feet at its highest point. Then he writes this, and this is where everything starts to become difficult to explain away. He says that in the lower section, from the waterline to perhaps 20 feet of elevation, the rock was rough, fractured, and consistent with what you would expect in an environment defined by repeated freezing and thawing. But above that elevation, the character of the surface changed completely. He says he measured this transition in 3 separate locations along the exposed face. And in all 3 cases, the transition occurred at approximately the same height. Then he gets even more specific. Above that line, the stone was smooth, not polished in the way glacial action produces smoothness, where you would expect directional striations. Not the kind of smoothing caused by ordinary geological wear. Smooth, he says, in the way worked stone is smooth when it has been deliberately finished. And then comes the sentence that stopped me the first time I read it. He writes, "I measured the transition line with my rod. It is level, not approximately level in the way a geological stratum runs, precisely level. A deviation of less than 2 inches across the full 400 yards of exposed face. I am a surveying officer. I understand what I am saying when I describe something as precisely level. I am saying this is not a natural feature. That is not a casual remark. That is not the language of someone drifting into fantasy. That is the language of a trained observer forcing himself to put something on the record that he clearly does not want to overstate." And he continues, For 3 more pages, Garrett describes the smooth stone above the transition line extending back into the cliff face to a consistent depth across all 3 measurement points. He notes that, in at least 2 locations, the surface texture displays regular intervals, repeating patterns he describes, and you can feel the reluctance in the wording as resembling the spacing of structural stonework. He actually stops to acknowledge how bad this sounds. He writes, "I am aware of how this reads. I have written it 3 times and changed the language each time trying to find a description that does not lead where this one leads. The intervals are regular. The surface is worked. The transition line is precise. I cannot find a geological explanation for all 3 occurring together. I am recording it here because I believe it should be recorded somewhere. That matters, because this is not a man building a grand theory. He is not speculating about lost civilizations. He is not reaching for mythology. He is doing the opposite. He is narrowing, testing, eliminating, writing with restraint." And pages 30 through 46, the pages that contain these observations, are exactly the pages Wilkes removed. Everything I've just described. Plus 12 more pages in which Garrett proceeds the way a surveyor would proceed. He works through possible natural explanations: differential erosion, columnar basalt, glacial polishing. He tests each possibility against the measurements he collected, and one by one he rejects them, not dramatically, professionally, carefully. He is not trying to prove anything extraordinary. He is trying to account for what he saw using the tools and knowledge available to him, and he keeps finding that the ordinary explanations do not fit. On the final removed page, he writes the clearest statement in the entire document. He says, "I have been asked by Commander Wilkes to submit this log for his review. I am complying. Before I do, I want to write this clearly, so that I have at least said it once in a document that bears my name. The coastline I surveyed in the sector assigned to the Peacock in the 2nd week of February, 1839, contains features not explicable by any natural geological process I am aware of," he continues. "The features are of sufficient scale and precision to constitute, in my assessment, evidence of prior human presence on this coast. I cannot say how old that presence was or what form it took. I can only say that the stone does not lie, and that the stone in the location I have described says something happened here before the ice came. I do not expect this record to remain intact after Commander Wilkes reviews it. I am filing it because a sailor has an obligation to say what he saw. And that is the point where this stops being a strange field observation and becomes something much harder to dismiss. Because Wilkes did exactly what Garrett expected him to do. Within 48 hours, the pages were removed. They were filed separately under a different reference number, with no index entry linking them back to the original logbook. And then they sat there, effectively buried in plain sight, for 138 years. Garrett returned with the expedition in June of 1842. His service record shows an honorable discharge in September of that same year, just 3 months later, listed as voluntary and at his own request. That is strange. He was 30 years old. He had 8 years of service. Officers with his rank and skill set, especially after an expedition of that scale, were not normally stepping away. They were moving forward. The Navy of the 1840s was expanding. Hydrographic and surveying ability mattered. Those were exactly the kinds of skills the institution needed. But Garrett left, and after that, the public record goes almost silent. There is no clear explanation for why he resigned. There is no later record of work in surveying, cartography, navigation, or anything adjacent to the profession that had defined his adult life. A man who had spent 8 years measuring coastlines with precision seams, from the surviving record, to have walked away from that entire world. The 1850 census places him in a rural county in Ohio, working as a farmhand. The 1860 census shows him in the same county with the same occupation. He dies in 1871 at the age of 58. His death record lists no occupation at all. That trajectory matters, not because it proves anything by itself, but because it fits too neatly with the possibility that something happened on that expedition that severed him from the life he had been building. And then there is the logbook itself. In 1889, Garrett's son donated it to the Federal Archive, with a short letter stating only that his father had asked for the document to be preserved somewhere it might eventually be read, by someone who would understand it. That line stayed with me, because his son did not know about the 17 missing pages. There was nothing in the surviving logbook to suggest that anything had been removed. Garrett had no complete copy left to pass down. Wilkes had made sure of that, so Garrett preserved what he could. Not enough to tell the whole story, but not nothing either. Now, on its own, that would already be unsettling. A trained surveyor documents something he cannot explain. His commander removes the pages, and the surveyor disappears into an ordinary life that seems completely disconnected from the career he had before. But Garrett is not the only reason this matters. The Wilkes expedition had 3 vessels operating in Antarctic coastal waters during the February 1839 window: the Peacock, the Porpoise, and the Flying Fish. Each carried a surveying officer. Garrett was on the Peacock. The Porpoise had Henry Eld. The Flying Fish had James Blair. And once you start following those names, a pattern begins to take shape. Henry Eld's expedition journals were published in partial form in the 1840s, but the original Eld manuscript at Yale's Beinecke Library contains 3 passages that do not appear in the published version. 2 of those omissions are minor. The third is not. In the unpublished passage, Eld briefly describes observing a section of coastal exposure that showed, and I'm paraphrasing here, regular geometric relief inconsistent with frost action or glacial formation. It is not as detailed as Garrett's account. He does not stop and work through it page after page the way Garrett does. He notes it and moves on. But the note is there in the original manuscript, and it is missing from the published version. Someone removed it between manuscript and publication. Then there is James Blair of the Flying Fish. His personal records from the expedition have not been located. That, by itself, might mean nothing. 19th century records disappear all the time. But Blair's name shows up in crew manifests and payroll records, and then, effectively, nowhere else. He did not publish. He left no known public correspondence. He does not seem to reappear in any professional context after the expedition's return. So look at the pattern. 3 surveying officers. Same general coastal sector. Same operational window. One leaves behind an account that is physically removed and separately filed. One has a manuscript passage edited out before publication. One leaves behind no recoverable personal record at all. That is not proof of a coordinated suppression campaign by itself. But it is absolutely a pattern. And it is a pattern pointing in one direction. Now widen the lens a little further. The Wilkes expedition was not the only national expedition to reach Antarctic coastal waters around that time. Within a span of roughly 14 months, 3 major powers were there. The French, under Jules Dumont d'Urville, reached the coast in January 1840. The British, under James Clark Ross, reached it in January 1841. The Americans, under Wilkes, had already been operating there through 1839 and into 1840. These were not friendly governments casually sharing notes. France and Britain had been at war within living memory of the men who commanded those expeditions. The geopolitical atmosphere mattered. These were rival powers, competitive powers. And yet, all three returned with Antarctic geological observations that are, in one way or another, either unpublished, redacted, or placed into archival categories that make them unusually difficult to trace. D'Urville's expedition documents were largely destroyed in the 1842 Versailles train accident, the crash that killed D'Urville, his wife, and his son. He was traveling with expedition materials on the day of the disaster. That fact has always bothered me. Not because train crashes are impossible, they clearly happen, but because physical expedition materials were with him. He was not simply retired and reminiscing. He was in possession of documents that apparently mattered enough to carry. Then there is Ross. Ross's raw crew logs were not publicly cataloged until deep into the 20th century. The official explanation for all of this is simple. These were extreme voyages, operating at the edge of navigational possibility, and discrepancies between raw notes and published accounts are normal. Editing happens. Scientific accounts get cleaned up. Field observations get narrowed into formal publication. And yes, that explanation is reasonable, up to a point. But it does not explain Garrett. Because Garrett was not overwhelmed by mystery or swept up in the drama of an unfamiliar landscape. He was a surveying officer. He was trained to observe, measure, compare, and record. He describes what he saw, then spends page after page trying to find a natural explanation for it. And he cannot. That is the part I keep coming back to. He does not say, "I think this is ancient civilization." He does not leap to a conclusion bigger than the evidence allows. What he says is narrower, and because it is narrower, it is stronger. He says the transition line is level across 400 yards. He says the smooth worked surface above it extends to a consistent depth at multiple independent points. He says there are repeating intervals in the stone texture resembling structural spacing. And he says he cannot reconcile all of those features with any geological process he knows. That is a very different kind of statement from wild speculation. That is a professional elimination of alternatives. And if he is right, even partially right, then the implications are enormous. Because stone does not casually produce a perfectly level transition line across 400 yards of exposed coastal face. Stone does not maintain worked-looking surfaces to consistent depths across separate measurement points by accident. Stone does not usually generate regular repeating intervals that resemble structural spacing, all in the same place, all at once, in a way that survives technical scrutiny from someone whose job is literally to distinguish natural formations from measured surfaces. Geology can do remarkable things. But geology does not easily do all of those things together. And Garrett knew that. That is why he wrote, "The stone does not lie." Not, "I do not lie." Not, "You should believe me." The stone does not lie. In other words, he is not asking to be trusted because of who he is. He is saying the evidence exists outside him. It is there whether anyone wants it to be there or not. Then think about what happened next. The institution that received his report did not refute it in writing. It did not annotate it with a geological correction. It did not preserve it beside the original as a disputed observation. It removed the pages. That response matters. Because when institutions encounter error, they usually correct it. When they encounter material they want forgotten, they separate it. And that is exactly what happened here. Garrett spent the rest of his life in Ohio. A farmhand, a former naval surveyor who, according to the surviving public record, never again used the skills that had defined his working life. He said nothing publicly. He published nothing. He left behind only the fragment Wilkes had not taken, and a private request passed through his son that the logbook be preserved somewhere. It might someday be understood. And somehow, despite everything, it survived. The part his son preserved survived. The 17 removed pages survived. Wilkes survived. Garrett did not. But the record did. And if that record is telling the truth, then it is pointing to a specific place on the Antarctic coast where a young surveying officer, in February of 1839, measured something he believed was not natural and may have existed there before the ice covered it. That is where the next questions begin, because once you accept that Garrett's account exists and that the removed pages were real, the obvious question is no longer whether the document is strange. The obvious question is, what exactly was at the location he recorded? And here is the part that makes this even harder to ignore. The pages Wilkes did not remove, the ordinary navigational entries before page 30, still contain the coordinates. Garrett never erased the route. He never concealed the sector. The location can still be identified. It is specific. It is traceable. And that means this is not just a story about an archival mystery. It is also a story about a place. A real place. A measured stretch of Antarctic coastline that, according to Garrett, displayed features he believed could not be explained by natural geological processes alone. Modern satellite imaging has mapped that coastline. Ice coverage in that region has shifted over the last century. There have been periods where the coastal margins were more exposed than at other times. Not constantly, not dramatically enough to make access easy, but enough to raise the obvious question: has anyone gone back and looked? As far as I can determine, the answer is no. Not because the coordinates are unknowable, not because the area is permanently beyond reach, but because the document that would tell someone exactly where to look has spent nearly 50 years since declassification sitting disconnected from its missing pages. The two halves of the record were separated so effectively that, unless someone found the footnote, then followed the reference trail, then realized the archival break concealed a single document, there was no clear path to reconstructing what Garrett had actually written. That disconnect mattered. It kept the record inert. It turned a potentially actionable observation into archival dust. And Garrett is only one part of the larger pattern. Because I cannot stop thinking about D'Urville. What exactly was in the expedition materials he was carrying on the day of the 1842 Versailles train crash? He was not on a leisure trip. He was traveling with documents, physical documents, materials important enough to be transported with him instead of being quietly left in some institutional repository. Why? What required personal carriage? What was he working on? What was he preparing, reviewing, or protecting? I do not know. But I also cannot dismiss the timing. Then there is Ross. What did James Clark Ross instruct his crew not to include? Because when researchers describe the surviving discrepancies in Ross's raw logs, they tend to cluster around the same broad category Garrett documented: geological observations in coastal exposure zones that do not fully make it into the official account. Again, the standard explanation is scientific compression, editing, simplification, the ordinary narrowing of field material into polished publication. And again, that explanation only goes so far. Because when three competing national expeditions operating within 14 months of one another all return with Antarctic geological observations that end up unpublished, redacted, delayed, or effectively buried, the pattern starts to exceed coincidence. And that leads to the largest question underneath all the others. If something on the Antarctic coastline caused three rival nations to independently suppress the same category of observation, what was it? That is not a small question. And I want to be careful here, because this is exactly where speculation can outrun evidence. The evidence does not tell us there was a city under the ice. It does not tell us there was a lost civilization in the dramatic, fantasy novel sense people immediately jump to. It does not tell us who built anything, when it was built, or whether what Garrett saw was part of a larger structure or only an isolated remnant. The evidence tells us something narrower. A trained surveying officer measured a coastal exposure zone in Antarctica in February 1839. He observed a precisely level transition line extending across roughly 400 yards. He observed smooth stone above that line that did not resemble ordinary glacial polish. He observed repeating intervals in the surface texture that suggested structural spacing. He tested natural explanations. He found them inadequate, and he concluded, carefully, reluctantly, and in writing, that the features constituted evidence of prior human presence on that coast. That is the claim. Not more than that, but also not less than that. And once you hold to the actual claim, the historical implications are already extraordinary enough. Because Antarctica's ice is not timeless in the simplistic way people often imagine. The ice coverage we know today is immense. But Antarctic coastal margins have changed over time. Exposure shifts. Retreat and advance happen. The coastlines seen by Garrett's generation, the first Europeans to document them in these sectors, were not necessarily the first coastlines ever exposed to air, water, or human sight. That matters. Something could have existed there long before the modern age of polar exploration. Something could have been built there, or altered there, or cut into the stone there, or all of the above. I do not know which. And Garrett did not know which either. What he knew was smaller and more solid than theory. He knew what the measurements said. He knew what natural rock should look like. He knew the difference between a rough, fractured face and a finished surface. He knew what level meant. And he knew enough to understand the seriousness of writing the sentence. I am saying this is not a natural feature. That sentence is the center of the whole thing, because it comes from a man whose professional identity was measurement. Not storytelling, not speculation, measurement. And then there is the human cost of it. Garrett did what institutions always say they want trained men to do. He observed carefully, recorded honestly, tested alternatives, and submitted his findings through the proper chain of command. And what happened? The accurate part, or at least the inconvenient part, was removed. Not rebutted. Removed. He then leaves the Navy within months, disappears into civilian obscurity, spends decades as a farmhand in Ohio, and leaves behind only the surviving fragment of his logbook with the request that it be preserved somewhere it might eventually be understood. There is something bleak in that. He did not become a crusader. He did not go public. He did not spend the rest of his life trying to force the world to listen. Maybe he knew how pointless that would be. Maybe he understood that once Wilkes had done what he did, the document itself was all that mattered. So he preserved the piece he still had. And decades later, that fragment survived him. It survived Wilkes. It survived bureaucratic indifference. It survived 138 years of separation from the 17 removed pages. And those pages survived too, filed under another number, sitting in a federal archive, connected to nothing until someone looked closely enough to reconnect them. That, to me, is the most unnerving part of all this. Not that the material vanished, that it almost vanished without vanishing, that it was not burned, not destroyed, not permanently classified, just broken apart and buried in procedure, which is often the more effective form of disappearance. So here is where I am left. What is under the ice in the sector the Peacock surveyed in February 1839? Has anyone ever physically re-examined the exact coastal margin Garrett described? What was in D'Urville's expedition materials on the day of the train crash? What did Ross file with the Admiralty that never made it into routine public cataloging? And why would an Admiralty archivist, in an internal 1948 memo not intended for public release, note that certain Ross expedition materials had been placed beyond routine access at the direction of parties he was not at liberty to name? Those are not rhetorical questions. Those are documentary questions, archival questions, location questions, questions that can, in principle, be followed. Because this investigation does not advance through mythology. It does not advance through fantasy. It advances through records, coordinates, logs, redactions, catalog anomalies, and the occasional sentence written by someone who knew exactly what he was saying. Garrett knew exactly what he was saying. That is why his words still matter. The stone does not lie. If he was right, then whatever he pointed to is still there, somewhere along that measured sector of coast, under ice that may not always remain where it is now. A young man in a ship's boat saw it in February 1839. He measured it. He wrote it down. And then he spent the rest of his life far from the sea because he had the professional integrity to record what the measurements showed. His logbook is still in that archive, both parts of it. The part his son preserved, and the 17 pages Wilkes thought he had buried, waiting, even now, for someone to go and look where Garrett pointed. If this raises questions you have not seen asked elsewhere, that is exactly why it matters. And if you have encountered parallel records from Wilkes, D'Urville, or Ross, specific records, specific documents, specific archival references, those are the only things worth bringing forward. Because this story is not built on speculation. It is built on a logbook. And the logbook is real.